Were you a child once? Are you still? Do you have children or plan to have children someday? And do you hope that if you have children, you'll be allowed to let them ride their bikes around the block or play outside? Do you hope that you can run an errand and leave your kids in the car with a smoothie on a reasonably cool day without being stopped by authorities? If you're not a parent, you too are affected. Perhaps you recall you were able to play outside and the rights you enjoyed as a child are no longer guaranteed. Or you are concerned about children on your block and you wonder if any adult knows where they are. And should you call authorities? Maybe you're wondering why these are even questions. Am I asking a question about a parent? Is this a parenting class? What do I, a lawyer who works with children in the child welfare, who works with families in the child welfare system, what do I have to say about any of these questions? No, this isn't a parenting class. The questions I'm asking, to my way of thinking, are very important legal and policy questions, and they're ones that I think that our society needs to do a better job of answering than it's been doing for the last 30 years. What's at stake is a basic right of children and families, and the laws, policies, and practices have an enormous impact. So to begin to answer the questions that I posed, I'm going to tell two stories. These involve parents who made the reasonable decision that they could let their children be alone, and the child welfare authorities disagreed. The first story I'm going to tell you is alarming, but it's not unusual. Both of these stories, by the way, involve me professionally as an attorney for families in the child welfare system. Natasha Felix had 3 children, ages 11, 9, and 5, and one day in the summer of 2013, her children wanted to play outside, and she thought that was fine. There was a park right next to her house, and she could look out the window, and every 10 minutes she was able to look out at them. They were outside for about 30 minutes. But while they were playing outside, a daycare teacher came by the park. And she apparently wasn't aware if there was an adult anywhere nearby. And so when she went back to her class, she called the Child Abuse and Neglect Hotline to report a suspicion of abuse. Now, you might expect that a child protection investigator would come to the house, find out that this was fine with the mother, that the kids were fine, and close the case. But that's not what happened. All through the summer, the investigation stayed open. And naturally, Natasha was fearful that if she let her kids play in the park again, they might be taken from her and put into foster care. She wouldn't even let her kids take out the garbage anymore. And at the end of the investigation, the state made a finding that she had neglected the children, and they put her name in the state child abuse register. That's not a criminal register, but it does operate as a blacklist. Now Natasha had an even bigger problem because she worked in the field of home health care and she was seeking employment. So now, because she had let her kids play outside, she could no longer pursue her career goals, and she was impaired in her ability to support her family. Now, I mentioned that this case was typical. How so? Well, first of all, the kids were fine. There is no history of abuse or neglect. Second, Natasha is a single mother and she's struggling to support her family. And third, she's an ethnic minority. She's a Puerto Rican Latina. Now, Natasha was able to appeal this decision, and we provided her a pro bono lawyer to assist her. And you might assume that the judge hearing the case would conclude that there was no neglect. But that's not what happened. In fact, the judge concluded that because the oldest child had attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, he could not watch his younger siblings. Now, mind you, there was no psychological testimony to say he couldn't supervise his younger siblings. That was just an assumption the judge made. So we appealed the case further, and it seemed like nobody cared what might happen to Natasha and her children until another case came along, a case that made international news and put the word free-range children and free-range parents into the national conversation. So in December of 2014, two children named Rafi and Devorah Meitiv were riding in the car with their father. They were 10 and 6 years old. They spotted a park and they asked their dad, could they go play in the park and then walk home? They knew the way. The dad said sure, but the kids, as they were walking home from the park, were stopped by the police. And soon child protection authorities were at the door demanding that the father agree to never let the kids be alone again. Otherwise, the authorities in Silver Spring, Maryland would take those children from the family. Naturally, he agreed. But then the family went to the Washington Post, and soon this case made international news. Now, I said the case was different than Natasha. The family was different, and the circumstances were different. In what ways? Well, first of all, Danielle Meitiv had become familiar with the term free-range parent. She had read a book by Lenore Skenazy, a New York journalist who had let her own son ride the New York City subway when he was 9 years old. And she then wrote a blog about it, and that generated a lot of energy and conversation about free-range kids. So Danielle Meitiv had actually made little signs for her kids, and the Washington Post picked up on that, and they soon were reporting about these kids as free-range kids, and we were all talking about free-range children. Now, the second way in which this family was different is that they were a white, suburban, middle-class family, and they were highly educated. And third, the children were extremely articulate, and the family was unembarrassed and unashamed of their decision to let the kids play. Even so, even with all the international media, the family problems did not abate. In April, they let the kids play in the park again, and the police picked them up and held them through the dinner hour. The family must have felt like the kids were kidnapped. But after that incident, they were able to negotiate a new policy with the authorities. So I mentioned the cases were connected to me. How so? Well, first of all, when the Meitiv story happened, people started talking about child protection. They realized that this was not a joke. Neglect findings are serious. They can have many consequences. There can be job consequences, employment, education consequences, consequences for custody. There's trauma to the children, anxiety for the parents. There may be legal bills. And there's, of course, an impact on the parenting decisions that are being made. In addition, people were asking questions about investigations. Our tax dollars are going to pay for this, and don't investigators have anything better to do? Soon I was getting media calls, not about the Natasha's case, which was the case I had worked on, but about the Meitivs in Silver Spring, Maryland. And we were being asked to do media interviews. So in order to give a better picture of what was going on to families like Natasha's, we decided to write a report. We issued it in July of 2015. And pretty soon, the case that was pending in the appellate court got the attention of the administration, and they wanted to drop the finding against Natasha finally and negotiate a new policy on when children can be alone. So how did we get to this point? How did we get to the point where we have all cases like the Natasha's case and cases like the Meitivs? Well, when I was a child and when many of you were children, there were no federal laws that required people to call child abuse hotlines when they suspected abuse or neglect. But in 1974, Congress passed a federal law and mandated that many types of professionals must call the hotline when they believe there may be abuse or neglect. As a result, we now have 7.2 million children reported in 2015 alone. Now, fortunately, Less than 10% of those cases are substantiated, and the numbers of physical and sexual abuse cases are actually dropping. But the overall numbers are not dropping, and that means that there are many cases that are being swept in the large category of neglect. In Illinois alone, there are 30,000 people registered as child neglectors for having engaged in what's called inadequate supervision. We can't distinguish the cases like Natasha's from the cases that may be serious, where a person has partied all night and left children unattended, which we would consider true neglect, because the data isn't broken down. But in our own office, there are many, many cases just like Natasha's, where we would say that this is not neglect. Now, why do we have so many calls? Well, 3 reasons. First, we have cell phones, and it's so easy to call. Second, we have very broad neglect statutes, which leave open-ended discretion to investigators to find neglect when they see it, even if a reasonable person would disagree. And third, people are encouraged to call, and there's very little understanding of the consequences of the call. So what can we do? Well, we do have an important tool. It's the United States Constitution. It provides that parents have the right, the fundamental right, a basic right, to raise their children and direct their upbringing as they see best, unless they are truly abusive or neglectful, in which case the state can limit those rights. But that poses the problem. How do we distinguish? How do we create a good policy that will catch the true neglectors and leave everybody else alone? I think we can agree that there's such a thing as too much supervision, and it's bad to mandate too much parental oversight over children. Look at this poor child.
Mari, look, he's still going and nothing's happening.
Sometimes it just is that way, Geraldine. Sometimes that's just the way it goes.
What do you mean? He's a college student. It's not normal.
Maybe it's just growing pains.
Since when is constipation a growing pain?
It is a growing pain.
Could you guys leave me alone for a minute?
What's with you always wanting to be alone? It's not normal. Don't you miss your parents? I don't know what to make of this. I can't deal with this, Mari. I'm going.
By the way, that's my younger son, and the smothering mother in the background is now my daughter-in-law, and the filmmaker was my older son, and this was made about 7 years ago right here at the University of Chicago for the 48-hour film festival. So how do we answer the question of what's a reasonable policy and balance all these interests? Well, who better to look to than reasonable parents and to reasonable professionals like the American Red Cross? The American Red Cross actually trains children as young as 11 to be babysitters for their younger siblings. And psychologists will say that children as young as 6 or 7 can be alone for short periods, and that's good for them. And of course, there's variation between children, but who better than the parent to make the decision about their child's capabilities? So we need to ask, what's a good policy and what's a bad policy? And let's look at a bad policy. This is Illinois policy until this month. I dare say, if you are a student at the University of Chicago, your parents may be in violation of this policy because you're put in a circumstance beyond your abilities, beyond your judgment, beyond your maturity. That's what education is all about. Let's look at a better policy. The new policy focuses in on blatant disregard of the duty of care to your children and obvious harm. We can ask, does this policy distinguish between Natasha, the Métives, and a truly neglectful policy? If it doesn't, it's a bad policy. In fact, it may be no policy at all. All across America, we have amorphous bad neglect laws that are being applied arbitrarily, usually to families that are disadvantaged, but often to families that have every advantage as well. This is bad for children because they need to be independent in order to grow, and it's bad for families who cannot live in fear. So It's a denial, when children cannot play outside, that's the denial of as fundamental right as I know. So what can we do? Can children be alone? Well, only if we fight for the right of all of us. It's all of us who are affected by this. So if you are concerned that a parent you know is letting their child be alone and you disagree that they should do that, realize that it's better to let that parent decide than to leave it to a child protection investigator who doesn't know that child. And realize, too, that having broad amorphous neglect laws affects all of us. We're all in this. And if we can't be safe in letting children go outside, then we are all in danger of losing our most precious rights. So can you let children be alone? Yes. Sometimes it's good for them. Thank you.